Hello and welcome to the BloodStream podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and BloodStream Media and made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I am your patient, advocate, and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I am your healthcare advocate, your nonprofit nerd, and your other host, Amy Board, reminding you to please speak with a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
Yeah, as a reminder, we are still not healthcare professionals.
Can't stress that enough.
On today's show, we do have a healthcare professional.
We do!
Expert in a number of things, including von Willebrand disease, and
Yes.
Dr. Nathan Connell joins us to talk about 100 years of von Willebrand disease. Big segment, big guest.
Big.
We've got that and more on this episode. Welcome to BloodStream.
And as always, thank you for joining us today. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the BloodStream podcast wherever you get those podcasts, and you can find us also on social media.
That's true.
It's like a whole thing.
I also want to remind you, dear listeners, that the BloodStream podcast is indeed made possible by our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Yes, that's right, Takeda. Takeda's got this website, bleedingdisorders.com, where you can learn all about Takeda's resources for and commitment to the bleeding disorders community. Takeda believes in a world free of bleeds.
Yes,
How
we
about
love that. What a vibe.
And they are dedicated more than ever in their efforts to offer a wide range of programs and support to help patients throughout their treatment journey, wherever on that journey they may be. And you can learn more by simply visiting bleedingdisorders.com. One more time, that's bleedingdisorders.com. And for their founding and ongoing support of the BloodStream podcast, I would just like to say thanks Takeda. You know, something that occurred to me last time we were recording, Amy.
Yeah.
It is Bleeding Disorders Awareness Month.
It is.
During Bleeding Disorders Awareness Month, the NBDF hosts Washington Days in D.C.
Yes.
Big smile out of you on Washington Days.
Yes, it's the best. It's the best day of the year. If you're an advocate, it's the best day of the year.
Well, for listeners who may be uninitiated, what even is Washington Days?
Good call. To be honest with you, the first time I went, I had no idea what it was. When a lot of times when people go, they have no idea what it is. They have no idea what they're going to be doing. People say, well, you're going to share your story with decision makers, and you're like, I don't know what that means. I'm not an expert in this. I have no idea. But it's basically, it's our government, it's our democracy at work, and I think it's really powerful. And I told my advocates this, and I feel like I have experienced it. You have experienced it firsthand. You know, when you're elected to office, either in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, you really truly are not an expert on every single walk of life. It's not your job to. It's not your job to know what hemophilia is. It's not your job to know how, having von Willebrand's disease would affect your access to treatment, your insurance landscape. It's not. They're not going to know that. It is our job as citizens to come in and to share, this is what this means to me. You have a decision that you're trying to make, a decision on, a bill or something to pass. There's an issue at hand. Someone has brought up an issue. It might be an insurance issue. It might be something, big that would affect someone with hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease or another rare bleeding disorder. And it is your job to go in there and to tell folks, hey, I know you're making this decision, and this is how this would affect me as your constituent. This is how it would be for the entire bleeding disorders community. And so have that knowledge and use that knowledge in order to make your decision.
Right.
And it's, people can be, cynical about it, but that's truly our democracy at work. Mm-hmm. And we have a wonderful national organization. Both national organizations really believe in advocacy. Our community is, I think, at the forefront of advocacy work because of what we experienced in the 80s and early 90s. And it's just an incredibly powerful day where you get to go to Washington, D.C. and sit with someone in an office as a constituent and say, this is how this issue affects my life. And I would hope that you would take that into consideration as you're making your decision. It's cool.
It's also interesting to witness representatives, senators, congresspeople who maybe go on to bigger positions within government.
Yes.
And to be building a relationship with those individuals.
Yes.
One of our senators here in California, Adam Schiff, was a congressperson who represented Los Angeles.
Right.
And I remember meeting him with Michelle Kim, and Michelle met with him many years as the executive director of the Southern California chapter, and he knew about hemophilia.
You build relationships with these people.
So as they go on in their careers,
Yes.
they don't all of a sudden forget about
Yes.
hemophilia and Michelle Kim. Those people
Yes.
stick around, those topics stick around. So it's a long-term investment
It is.
in the advocacy of our community every time you meet with somebody.
Yes.
And even meeting with staff members. Sometimes people, oh, I'm meeting with the staffer of so-and-so.
Yeah.
Well, that person is in the trenches. That
Yeah.
person is like helping their
Yeah.
boss determine whether or
Yeah.
not they're going to make a vote in a certain direction or another.
Yeah.
And that person's going to go on to have a career.
Yes.
So every opportunity to teach and
Yes.
advocate goes beyond that moment.
Yes. And I mean, if you can, translate as you're sitting there, it does feel like it goes into the ether. You say like
It
this
can.
story and you're like, okay.
Goodbye.
But when you learn the inner workings of those staff members, of what that office is about, they really do tally those things of this is how this would work. And it really does affect the decision-making process. And a lot of times things are very political. We're living in a very combative political state right now, so it's very political, but it's so important because this is your life, this is your reality, this is how this issue would affect you as a human being, and they have a right to know that, and we have a right to share that. It really truly is democracy. It's an honor. It's cool.
So Washington Days 2026 has come and gone by now, but if you're listening to this and you're curious about maybe how you can participate in your state may have upcoming Hill Days, so check in with your local chapter or member organization leadership. Find out when your state's organized lobbying day takes place. And if you've never gone before, as Amy said, that's the case for many people. I remember the first time I went, I had no idea what I was doing. As
Yeah.
you described, they're like, share your story. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I
Yeah.
don't know. There's people who will educate you on what the actual issues of the day is and who can speak to that. Truly, if you're interested, that's all it takes, the interest. So
100%.
learn more and become an advocate if you're not already.
Are you inspired? I feel inspired sitting here.
Let's go.
I know. I love it.
Well, speaking of advocates, Dr. Nathan Connell is just that. He's not only a healthcare provider, but he is an advocate for the patients and caregivers that he serves. Amongst them are patients with von Willebrand disease. Von Willebrand disease was first identified now 100 years ago in a little girl named Jortis Sundblom on the Åland Island. I probably pronounced most of that incorrectly. But it's been 100 years since what was described as non-hemophilia bleeding got characterized as von Willebrand disease. What has happened over that 100 years? How has care and management progressed? What is the state of care today around the world? And what are we looking for tomorrow? That's what Dr. Nathan Connell is here to discuss, and he joins me right now. All right, Dr. Nathan Connell, a repeat guest here on the BloodStream podcast. I was just looking at your bio. So we've got a number of titles here. Chief of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Faulkner Hospital, Vice Chair of Medicine for the BWFH Clinical Services and Education, Associate Director, Boston Hemophilia Center, and Associate Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School. Did I miss any?
It's a lot of hats that I wear, but I'm really excited to be here today to talk with our bleeding disorders community.
Yeah, no kidding. I think I also just saw that you were recently at EHAD, which I believe was held in Dublin, Ireland. What were you doing at EHAD?
So EHAD it was my first time ever attending the meeting. It's been going on, I think this was the 19th Congress that they've had. And I was invited to give a talk about gender diversity in the care of people with inherited bleeding disorders. And so it was a really great opportunity to bring up some discussion around how do we create appropriate and safe spaces, how do we manage the risk of clotting and bleeding with different hormonal therapies, different types of surgeries, and how do we as a community support a group of people who experience really tough bleeding challenges and maybe are not navigating a system that is designed to help them. So it was a really great opportunity to just start a conversation and put some information into people's minds for them to think about.
Wow, that's an entirely other conversation for us to have at some point. So I'm glad that we touched on it here at the top. But I do want to focus our talk today on von Willebrand disease. I had a line in our planning for this podcast, which was 100 years of von Willebrand disease. And it was just sitting there for 6-7 weeks. I hadn't figured out what exactly I was going to do with this subject. And then I saw your post on LinkedIn about 100 years of von Willebrand disease. that you were highlighting your recent publication in Blood Advances, simply titled Treatment of von Willebrand Disease. And I'll note that you are the sole author on this piece, published February 2nd of this year. So I guess to start off, if you had to summarize the current state of vWD treatment and care in one or two ideas, what would those be?
It's a really great question. And I think writing that article helped give me the perspective of how far we've really come in the last 100 years. I would say that, one, we've made incredible progress in access to treatment and understanding, using evidence, what is a good way to approach treatment. But I would say the second piece is that we still have a lot to learn about treatment, particularly when it comes to the best ways to provide prophylaxis. How do we use therapies that may have been designed and tested in people with hemophilia or other bleeding disorders, and really a focus on women and girls who have traditionally been disproportionately affected due to reproductive tract bleeding that is, so serious in people with vWD.
To be certain. So there's some complexity to vWD that I'd like to unpack a little bit. And it comes through, one of the things that comes through in your paper is the movement toward treating vWD in an individualized manner, something that's been popularized, we'll say, within hemophilia, but maybe is newer to the world of vWD. Why is von Willebrand disease in general so complicated to manage, and maybe more so than most people realize?
Well, I think that it's because von Willebrand factor, the protein in our blood that actually is at the heart of von Willebrand disease, is a very big protein. The gene is incredibly large, and it's not just that one gene that affects the type of bleeding that someone has. There are probably at least 30 to 50 other genes that interact with this, help package it, and put it into the places in the body that it needs to be, whether it's stored in the lining of the blood vessels or packaged into platelets. When we think about the hemophilia A, for instance, the factor VIII gene is a decent size. The factor IX gene is smaller, and they're very localized, and we know a lot about that gene and the effects that it has on people. But just like somebody can have a mutation in their factor IX or VIII gene, and they have more bleeding or less bleeding than somebody else with that same gene, I think that's just magnified with von Willebrand disease. And because of the gene being so big, having many jobs, not just one job like many other proteins, it gives an opportunity for more things to break, and therefore you need a better set of treatments that approaches all the different aspects in order to really address the bleeding from a holistic view.
And you go through what I'll call the toolbox that we have for treatments of von Willebrand disease in the paper, from desmopressin to antifibrinolytics, most commonly tranexamic acid, to von Willebrand factor replacement therapy. How are hematologists today in the clinic working with patients to land on which therapy and protocol is right for each patient? How is that happening today?
So for a lot of this, it first starts with just understanding and getting to the right diagnosis, which in and of itself can be challenging with the tests that we have and the repeat testing that needs to take place oftentimes to get to not just a diagnosis of von Willebrand disease, but the specific subtype, type 1, 2, or 3. And then there, even under type 2, there are many different types. And each one of them responds differently. So first is getting the right diagnosis so you can understand what are all the options you have. And then understanding the specific situation. So for instance, desmopressin may work very well for somebody with heavy menstrual bleeding or a minor procedure. I use it quite frequently in people who are having a colonoscopy and may need to have biopsies taken. Whereas if that same person needed to get their gallbladder removed or their appendix taken out, desmopressin probably isn't going to last long enough to control bleeding for as long as I need to. So at that point, I'm going to start making a decision about using some sort of von Willebrand factor concentrate. And even then, as we start to think about other adjunctive therapies, you mentioned the antifibrinolytics, which are probably my favorite thing. I'm a big, prescriber of tranexamic acid in the adult population. I know that a lot of pediatricians have had success with epsilon aminocaproic acid, also known as Amicar, because they have liquid formulations that they can apply topically in kids, and it's a lot easier. When I'm on call, the fellows here at the hospital have this joke that if you have to call Dr. Connell and ask him whether you should give the tranexamic acid, he'll tell you that in the time it took you to call me, you could have just given the tranexamic acid and helped control the bleeding. It works really well for a lot of different types of bleeding with very few downsides. And I would say that you're more likely to save a life by giving an antifibrinolytic or have somebody have it at home than just, thinking about whether or not it should be given in this specific situation. So a lot of different options, and you personalize it to the type of bleeding somebody is having, what the scenario is, and then even their subtype of von Willebrand disease.
Makes perfect sense. Most people with von Willebrand disease would be treated in an on-demand fashion, at least historically, but there is this growing movement toward prophylaxis, at least for certain patients. What do you think is driving that?
So I think there are a couple things driving prophylaxis. One is a better understanding and comfort in bleeding disorder centers across the country about prophylaxis in general for bleeding disorders, whether it's hemophilia or von Willebrand disease. I think the fact that we have made an effort to try and ensure that people with vWD have access to hemophilia treatment centers and should be managed by a hematology team that has experience in these disorders allows us to sit there and say, here's our experience with prophylaxis in hemophilia, and here's how we might modify or use it specifically. In 2021, when we published the International vWD Guidelines, we came out with the very first evidence-based recommendation for prophylaxis and put it as the number one of the many recommendations that we published for people to consider. And so we put it first and foremost in the front of everyone's eyes. And you're not supposed to have favorites on the recommendations when you're writing all this manuscript, but the prophy recommendation is my favorite. And the reason that is because people have told me they went to their hemophilia center, asked for it, were initially told no, but went back with the recommendation, and they used that with their hemophilia or bleeding disorders team to get the insurance companies to approve it, and it's led to a change in their quality of life. That, to me, is the most important aspect. We've also started to recognize that factor prophylaxis has a value in heavy menstrual bleeding. And we have a lot of different ways to approach heavy menstrual bleeding with both therapies that involve hormones and ones that don't involve hormones. But sometimes those therapies aren't ideal, and people still are having an effect on their lives, whether it's missing school, work, becoming so iron deficient that they need iron infusions or blood transfusions. And so if we can provide factor prophylaxis and give it in a way that it's just for their menstrual periods, for instance, they don't need to take it all the time. Well, that counts as, regular prophylaxis instead of thinking that it's just truly on-demand therapy. So it's really been a culture shift in bleeding disorders care, along with evolving evidence and a recognition that we really need to focus on this.
Speaking of care and bleeding disorders, comprehensive centers, talk for a moment about the models of care that exist and how do we evolve the model of care for von Willebrand disease by leveraging existing hemophilia or bleeding disorder centers, exploring other alternatives to providing expert care for people with von Willebrand disease. What does the evolving model of care look like?
Yeah. For me, what do I tell my patients is that you should be managed in a center that has somebody who understands your von Willebrand disease and all of the treatment options and has access to all the resources that we think people with bleeding disorders should have, such as access to social workers, physical therapists, nursing, pharmacy support. For instance, physical therapy. For years, people were told, well, you have von Willebrand disease, you can't have joint bleeding. There is no joint bleeding in von Willebrand disease. But we know, as studies have been published, that that actually is not true. People with von Willebrand disease can have joint bleeding, and it can lead to debilitating changes over the course of their life. Can we intervene? Can we get them resources and support? And I think that obviously the Hemophilia Treatment Center model has been wildly successful for improving access and quality of care. We now have guideline recommendations around that for people with hemophilia, and we would have loved to make a recommendation around that for the vWD guidelines, but there are only so many questions you can answer. And so we put into there things about, access to many of these therapies and resources. I think on the one hand, more centers are being open to people with vWD, and not just hemophilia and vWD, but also rare factor disorders, because I think that's another group that deserves the same access to care. But as somebody who works in a center, I can also understand the fear that comes with that, in that we don't have a lot of hematologists in this country who focus on bleeding disorders. And while we may have set up an infrastructure, for many people, it's a really long drive to get to some of these centers. So how do you provide care local and collaborate with a hematologist that is much closer to home? We just don't have the resources set up right now to be able to take every person with vWD and see them in the comprehensive care model. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. It just means that we need to advocate more for access to those models for this patient population. We made a decision in our own center on the adult side a long time ago that anybody with type 2 or type 3 vWD really should be seen by the comprehensive bleeding disorders team in our traditional comp clinic. But then what about people with type 1? If every single person with type 1 in the Boston area was seen in us, we wouldn't be able to see anything else. We wouldn't be able to get in any of our patients in a timely fashion. And so, working with the hematologists in our group that do have an interest in bleeding disorders, for things like very mild forms of type 1 von Willebrand disease, they don't need to be seen in a comprehensive clinic, but have access to somebody who can then redirect them to our resources should that become necessary. And so I love it, because now it's not just me and my team. It's me, my team, and a whole group of hematologists, 10 of us that see patients clinically, that have that experience and benefit from having the same guidelines and approach, and can be able to flex as needed.
Since we've brought them up a few times and it's clear how important these guidelines are, what's the next iteration of these guidelines? Is there something underway? Is that yet to come? Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, the guidelines don't just end with their publication. And, for many people, you think, okay, the end product is the guideline. Well, that's just one step on this long journey towards improved care for people with von Willebrand disease. And so the first step afterwards was really understanding how could you implement a lot of these things, and see how these recommendations worked out. How could we address knowledge gaps? Well, but then the second piece really came last year, when we realized, okay, it's already time to do the update on the evidence and say, we finished our evidence searches in 2020 and we published in 2021. Well, in 2024, we decided to re-perform all the searches and see, is there anything new that has come out in that time period? Anything that would change the strength or the direction of a recommendation? Maybe it would take it from a suggestion, to a strong recommendation where you would say, I recommend, and most people should receive this. So we redid that, and the chairs of the panels worked with the American Society of Hematology and a medical librarian to redo all those searches. And we sat down and reviewed all that data. And while there were many new publications since 2020, none were large enough or significant enough that it would change what we recommended. However, there were several studies, particularly around prophylaxis, recombinant von Willebrand factor, the Will31 study with plasma-derived von Willebrand factor, the vWD-Min study, looking at how do you take these factor concentrates and apply them in specific situations. And in every case, it supported what we had recommended and said, yes, prophylaxis works. It is important for many people. You have a lot of options. So we decided to publish an update to the guidelines about that information, published last year in Blood Advances. And it really was to say, yes, the current evidence of the guideline stands. The next piece that I think all of us would love to do is to think about, how do you adapt the guidelines into differently resource settings? And that is a challenge on its own. And we have to make sure that we've got the right groups and partners together. And there are several people in the bleeding disorders community that are taking this on in an effort to really think, should WFH be involved with this? What can the NBDF do? What can ASH and ISTH that all came together at the beginning to make this? What's the right partnership and structure to be able to say, how do we adapt it to a place where you can't get the diagnostic testing that we think about on a regular basis? Maybe sending out for genetic testing is actually easier than getting the functional tests in some countries. What do you do when you don't have access to plasma-derived von Willebrand factor concentrates? How do you leverage desmopressin? How do you use things like pathogen-reduced cryoprecipitate, which is what we used for many years before we even had these specific factor concentrates? That is really a big question, and I think that is the next step for our global community, in addition to thinking about the knowledge gaps that exist and how we address those scientific questions.
Yeah, that makes good sense. It's not enough to make progress in a certain part of the world. We need to think about progress holistically everywhere, but it means something different in different environments with different constraints. All right, so my final question to you, Nathan, and I appreciate your time, is 100 years ago, we have the first individual that was identified as having what we now know to be von Willebrand disease. It was considered pseudohemophilia or non-hemophilia, right? Some bleeding disorder, but we couldn't quite wrap our arms around it. We've made incredible progress over these last 100 years. But if von Willebrand disease were discovered today, what do you think the difference in how care has progressed would be if it wasn't discovered until 2026?
It's an amazing question, that, counterfactual question, the what if we could go back in time and see if we could make the first description at a time where we had many more resources. One, I would hope that it wouldn't get the name pseudohemophilia. I know that's what was applied, and it was the best description that was available at the time. I think that the main reason it was called that is because it affected men and women. And so you already set up a potential that it's not taken as seriously because women are affected. I would like to hope that today the medical community and the bleeding disorders community as a whole understands that bleeding disorders affect women too, and that there would be a lot of effort and research money put behind it. I would like to also hope that we would have improved diagnostic testing, getting people answers, and helping people not suffer in silence. Those are the things I would hope. It's a bit of an interesting question because it almost says, in some ways we've done phenomenally well in the last 100 years with better diagnostics and the creation of these treatments. But I think it's far lagged behind our work in not just hemophilia, but many other chronic conditions that exist in medicine, even though it's so common and underdiagnosed. So my hope is that all the same things that I hope for today, that we do a better job in diagnosing people who are suffering, that we do a better job in getting access globally to people, and that we reassure people that they're not alone, that they're part of a community. Those are all the things that I would hope for the young woman who was diagnosed with this 100 years ago, just as I would for a young woman who's diagnosed with it today, or any person who's living with it. So it's a great question, and makes you really think about what the next 100 years of von Willebrand disease treatment and diagnosis and progress are going to look like.
Well, as long as we have people like you on the front lines of pushing it forward, I have confidence we'll continue to make good progress. But I do have to ask you just actually one quick final clarifying question. Embarrassingly, have I been mispronouncing your name?
Oh, it's happened my whole life. Everybody in my family, I grew up, my father's family is from the South in Birmingham, and everybody in the South says Connell. And then there's parts of the family that came in through, I think, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and they all say Connell. So, I'd heard it so many different ways. It doesn't even faze me. I don't even notice it. So.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I will try to get in the habit of saying Nathan Connell, but I appreciate your acceptance of Connell also. You truly are a wealth of information, and I mean it. People like you give me as a patient, not with von Willebrand disease, but as someone who has hemophilia, cares a lot about the bleeding disorder space. We need HCPs, hematologists, researchers like you who are so committed, who care, who come on podcasts like this to disseminate information and share with the community. Thank you for doing all you do. Keep it up. And anytime I can be helpful, you know that I'm interested in that conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again, Dr. Nathan Connell, for joining the program today and deep diving von Willebrand disease with us. We appreciate your time and expertise and your advocacy. Thanks as always to our presenting sponsor, Takeda, bleedingdisorders.com for more. We could not produce this show without your support, and we are grateful for it. Amy Board, our next episode comes out April the 13th. What can the listeners expect to hear? That's a Friday the 13th.
Oh, it's a Friday the 13th.
So everybody look out, I
think.
It's
a whole to-do. Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be 4 days before World Hemophilia Day, so I'm sure there'll be...
lots of 4-day before planning.
If you will, like celebrations in the street and everything. But really, we've got so many exciting new segments coming up this year, and I don't know if they'll start in April. It just kind of depends on production and things, but be on the lookout. There's exciting stuff coming up this year.
That's true.
So
that means you better subscribe to the BloodStream podcast if you haven't already to make sure you get it the moment it goes live.
Whoa.
And with that, dear listeners, that is all for this episode.
Hey, loyal listeners, because you're loyal, I can tell. If you made it to this part, you
this
are
is loyalty.
Loyal. This is legitimate loyalty every single time. But email us at all the things. Mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com. That's where you can chat with us. That's where you can tell us your story. We would love to know if you have any interest in casting opportunities for some of our films. Always things, please. That's where you can find us at mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com and also on social media. We're everywhere. Everywhere.
I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your other host, Amy Board.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, y'all.